Welcome to Conversations with HJM. I'm Lisa Harris-Jones.
And I'm Tommy Thompson.
And today we're joined by Dr. Mileah Kromer, who is the director of the Goucher College poll. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So, this is a big year. We just got through a primary. We've got the general election coming up in November 8th. What do you predict will happen in November? Looking at the governor's race, we have Democratic nominee Wes Moore, and then we have Republican nominee Dan Cox.
I think if you look back at our polling that we have done now in Maryland, we turned 10 this year. So the Goucher College poll has been around for 10 years, through the entirety of the Hogan years and through the entirety of the Trump presidency. And what I can tell you is that Maryland Democrats, who make up the majority of statewide voters, they're willing to put their weight behind, at least a third of them are, a Republican like Hogan. But what we've seen from our polling is that Republicans that are closely aligned with Trump, which is somebody like Dan Cox, who was supported by Trump during the Republican primary, Trump has only been able to muster among Maryland Democrats around a 10% approval rating during his time in office. So what becomes a benefit in the primary becomes a major hindrance in terms of that endorsement in the general election.
And leading into the primary election, you teamed up with the Baltimore Banner, and I thought it was really insightful, a lot of the polling that came out of polling people in the community, but specifically with Baltimore City. The voters had a lot on their minds going into the polls. Can you tell us what they were thinking as they went to the polls?
We have wanted to poll Baltimore City, or at least I have, since I took over, since I founded the Goucher College poll in 2012. Finally, the Baltimore Banner presented us with the opportunity to partner together to help offset the cost. Anybody in the political business knows that the problem with polling is the cost. So we were able to actually sample Baltimore City residents and ask them about those most pressing issues. It shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody that crime is the #1 issue facing Baltimore City residents. It's a persistent problem, and it's a problem because it bleeds into in the communities in terms of the way they feel in terms of public safety. And those types of feelings, I think, are really detrimental for a city who wants to turn things around, who wants to grow, who wants to have some greater economic development. And I think that's really what our poll showed, that they have to address the public safety problem.
When is going to be the right time to start polling Marylanders for the November 8th? It's just curious, what the difference will be with the turnout and who's going to vote in the general as opposed to those that voted in the primary.
Right. I mean, I don't think there's ever like a perfect time to do polling. Obviously, I think that folks really seem to tune in after Labor Day weekend. I wouldn't want to put a poll in the field anytime in the next couple of weeks where kids are going back to school, people are focusing on those last couple of weeks of summer. But you'll see polls like ours, and most likely the Washington Post and other individuals who do statewide polling will start to take a closer look at that race sometime in mid-September to mid-October. Mm-hmm. And then hopefully we'll get to see a debate put on the schedule. And usually we see polls trying to fall around the debates.
Yeah, so Governor Hogan was an interesting candidate in that he had 28%, I think you shared with us earlier, that of African Americans that actually voted for Governor Hogan. But with Dan Cox and even the candidate that's running against Democratic nominee Anthony Brown, what's that going to look like? Those are different candidates. What are your thoughts on that?
So when you think about the choices that Maryland Republican voters made in that primary election, they decided to double down on an allegiance to the more Trump wing of the Republican Party and turn their back in some ways on Kelly Schultz and the AG candidate that Hogan endorsed. Hogan's way is really the only way in Maryland for a Republican to piece together those types of votes to win a statewide election. It becomes very difficult otherwise. There's a couple reasons behind that. I think that there was certainly some ideological cohesion. African American voters are not as progressive as their white counterparts. That's all of our polling has shown that, as well as nationwide. And I think that's what puts Wes Moore also in an advantageous position. Wes Moore hasn't staked out a clear, only left, only progressive lane. The policy platform that he has put together thus far is broad, and it pulls in elements, I think, for both moderates can like, as well as progressives.
So, Dr. Kromer, you'll be happy to know that when your pollsters call, I actually answer their questions. I don't hang up on them.
That's good.
But as I answer the questions, I always wonder, how those questions make the poll and why, like, there's important things to me that aren't asked of me. So how do you decide how you shape your polls?
So first and foremost, the Goucher College poll is based in an academic institution at Goucher College, and we're really big on learning by doing. And so a big part of our education in the political science program is the students actually helping me come up with questions, and I teach them how to write survey questions by them actually picking it out and researching, and us working together. Of course, I get a lot of influence from the outside political world. I get emails all the time from people. You should email me anytime you'd like. If it's a good idea, if it's pertinent to Marylanders broadly defined, there's a good chance that it can get put on the poll.
So I know you said we're going to see a poll sometime after Labor Day. It seems like the opportune time. How do you balance that, though, with, we've expanded early voting pretty far out from the actual general election? How do you not encroach upon that and actually maybe shift people's thoughts?
I think that has been an interesting question, because now it's not just early voting, it's like the prevalence of mail-in voting. And so I think for pollsters like me and everybody else, what you tend to do is you try to adjust the likely voter screen questions to include a response option. So if you do cross over into early voting periods, if you're in the field during early voting period, you just make sure that you allow respondents to say, I've already voted, during early voting, or I've already voted by mail. So it's really important when you're kind of constructing these polls that you give people the appropriate response options to accurately reflect what they're doing, so you can finally screen down to those likely voters and have a good sort of snapshot of what that race looks like in those final waning weeks.
If you had a crystal ball, as we sit here with the three big elections that are coming up in November, you have the governor's race, the AG's race, and the controller's race, as well as there's a handful of county executive races that are contested. What are your predictions from looking at the polls that you've already done?
Well, I'll tell you that pollsters, we don't look at crystal balls, we take snapshots in time. So I can't tell you a prediction of the future, but what I can tell you is you can clearly look at some of the trends that we have traced over the years here in Maryland, how likely voters are to cross over to vote for the other party, which is what Republicans need. It doesn't matter how unified the Republican Party is. It doesn't matter how the percentage of Republicans that turn out to vote. The majority of our statewide voters are Democrats, and plus around 18% are independents. So they have to have crossover appeal. And so anybody looking at this election, trying to do their own sort of prognostication, the question is they need to ask themselves is how many Democrats do they think reasonably would cross over to vote for either of the Republican AG candidate or the Republican nominee for governor.
Well, I don't want to keep you. I hear you're trying to get to ice cream over
ice
at
cream.
the MACo Conference Center, but thank you for joining us. And if there's anything else that you'd like to share while we have our viewers, this is your time.
Well, I have to plug, of course, Goucher College. So if you have a student that is rising and will be looking at colleges, Goucher College is a great place to be.
Thank you. And thank you for joining us with Conversations with HJM.